Hi, and welcome to the 81st in our series on Middle Eastern and Islamic history. Today, we are going to finish up our story on Iraq. So here are the rules for those of you who are unfamiliar. This is not an academic presentation. I'm not accredited in history, religion, philosophy, or any of the subjects that we're going to be discussing today. That said, this is going to be a secular presentation, meaning that I'm not going to try to take a side on any of these issues and just sort of walk you through the history. I also want to say that these topics, especially when we're talking about Islamic State, can be extremely sensitive. So let's be respectful to the topic. That said, I love interactivity, questions, comments, clarifications. Please put those in the chat. I do read the chat and will respond in real time. I'll also have a question and answer section after both 81A and after 81B to address questions that you may have, and I'll more than willing to listen to spoken questions at that time. What I like to say is these presentations are a 101 and a 201, meaning that if you don't know that much, a 101, I'll catch you up. And if you know something already about the situation, I'll probably still tell you things you didn't know. I also have what I call a 2-hour hard stop, which means that if at 9 p.m. Eastern time, if I haven't gotten to all my slides, that's okay. It's just going to go into next week. And wouldn't you know, next week is just the continuation of this presentation anyway, where we're going to talk about the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s in Turkey, perhaps get to the 21st century, and then we will have a final presentation that will take us all the way to the present. If I put dates below a person, it is typically their years of service, especially if we're talking about political figures. If we're talking about thought leaders, people who never held a political office, then those are their years of life. And this will be recorded just like all the other 80 entries in the Middle Eastern and Islamic history series, which you can watch at our YouTube channel. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel to constantly see all of the different videos from all of the different groups that we have at History Mostly Ancient Discussions. And of course, you can follow all of the presentations in this podcast. And if you enjoy what we do and you want to be part of the Zoom, that's fantastic. We'd love to have you. Please join our meetup and you can get updated as to when all of our presentations are. There are other meetups that may have some of our Zooms, but don't have all of them because there are a number of different presenters here at History Mostly Ancient. And finally, we have Premium Zoom, Premium Meetup, and Premium YouTube, which all cost us a pretty premium. So we appreciate anything you can do to help us keep the lights on. That said, we'll continue to put up these presentations for free, but help is always appreciated, and you can send that money to the PayPal and Buy Me a Coffee links below. All right. So where we left off last week was that Iraq was going through a civil war during the American occupation. And that civil war had really two distinct parts to it in terms of the physical location of where those civil war actions were taking place. The first one is in Baghdad and to the areas to the north and to the west of it. In fact, this area is typically called the Sunni Triangle because it has triangular points at the three largest Sunni cities in the country. That's Baghdad, Ramallah, and Tikrit. Baghdad, Ramadi, and Tikrit. And these three cities basically formed the basis of the Sunni insurgency, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. The second area is to the southeast of Baghdad in the majority Shiite regions of the country, and this was an internal conflict between different Shiite groups asserting power, usually based on clan loyalties or based on localized interests. Now, talking about the Sunni conflict was primarily directed against the American forces, and it came from a understanding by the Sunni population that had been empowered under the reign of Saddam Hussein, that they would lose that power under the Americans, especially as 2006 rolled around and you had the de-Baathification. Now, de-Baathification was a wide policy pursued by Bremer, who was the leader of the American occupation, that would forbid anybody who had Ba'ath Party membership from serving in any governmental capacity. And we should understand how extreme this was in terms of how many people it upended the lives for. In Iraq, in order to become a university professor, you had to be a Ba'ath Party member in most cases. In order to be a functionary of any level, you had to be a Ba'ath Party member. In order to get and go to university and get a highly skilled job. In many cases, you had to be a Ba'ath Party member. So by engaging in de-Baathification, over 60% of the educated individuals in Iraq were now barred from having leadership roles in the future of the country. And also remember that starting in 1990, the Iraqi economy had cratered. And so this is about 15 years later after that. So we're talking about exactly the generation that would have needed to go to university and got bottlenecked, exactly the generation that would need to go into the public service and got bottlenecked. And of course, almost all of the leaders of the military also had to be Ba'ath. So you made these people not only unemployed from their current job, but unemployable. And the disproportionate majority of these individuals, because Saddam's regime prioritized Sunni Arabs over the other populations in Iraq, were Sunnis. So that insurgency was built around a number of Islamist militants, jihadist militants. These are individuals who want to create an Islamic theocratic state, but had absorbed into their ranks a significant number of former Saddam Hussein officials who, secular is a strong term for it, but were not religiously fixated in the same way that the jihadists were. And so you end up having this synergy that occurs between educated individuals, especially in a military perspective or in a digital or technological perspective, being integrated into these more religious-minded groups like Al-Qaeda Iraq that is led by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi until he's assassinated in 2006. But we're going to follow Al-Qaeda Iraq because Al-Qaeda Iraq is the forebearer of Islamic State. So we're going to track that story a little bit. The other side of this was the Shiite conflicts that were occurring. Sorry, let me one last thing to finish with the Sunnis is that there were a number of Sunnis eventually, especially in Anbar province, which is the westernmost province of Iraq, that felt that Al-Qaeda and other militants like them who were seen positively for going against the Americans were effectively behaving like thugs. And so they did what any concerned set of parents would do. They banded together to try and figure out how to get the thugs out of the neighborhood. And the way that they did that is by coordinating with the Americans to create the Sons of Iraq organization. And the Sons of Iraq, especially by 2007, had mostly cleared out the Sunni uprising and pushed it towards the borders with Syria. On the Shiite side, you had sort of two different camps. The first of these camps were those that wanted a more pro-Iranian outlook to Iraq. Now, we've talked about before that there were organizations like SIRI, the Supreme Council of the Islamic Resistance in Iraq, that was effectively an Iranian plant group, right? They believed in the Vilayat al-Faqih, the guardianship of the jurist, political philosophy upon which Iran is based. And there were a number of militant groups that were associated with that development. Of course, there's the IRGC itself, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, or the Pasdaran, which is sort of the exponents of the Iranian Revolution. But there were also indigenously Iraqi militias that were Iranian creations, or Iranian-supported creations, perhaps is better to say, like Jaish al-Mahdi or Asab al-Haq. And these organizations tried to control territorial regions throughout the Shiite portion of Iraq, that southeastern portion of the country. On the flip side of that, you had individuals that rejected both the American occupation and rejected the increasing Iranization of the Shiite regions of Iraq. And Muqtada as-Sadr is probably the most famous among these. He is known primarily in the Western media for his resistance to the Americans. In fact, he became the leading Shiite cleric in the historic Medina Thawra, the city of the revolution that was built by Abd al-Karim Qasim, but of course was long past the time of splendor in 2005 and had become a decrepit slum. And because of Muqtada as-Sadr's powerful control there, the city was often renamed Sadr city, especially by the Americans, who could not penetrate that ghetto, for want of a better term, because of how well Sadr's militants defended it. But Sadr also went after these kind of Iranian allied Shiites as well, because he, in his view, Iraq should be an Iraqi country. It shouldn't be ruled by any foreign power, be it Iran or the United States. And there's a third camp which doesn't fight on the battlefield, but that is groups like the Islamic Dawah Party, which are Shiite groups, relatively secular, relatively aligned with the American policies, and of course, they come into the crosshairs of both of these organizations. And it's worth pointing out that both the Iranian exponents and the Sadrites and the similar groups to them have no qualms about political assassination. So we have numerous assassination attempts throughout this period of 2005 to 2008 of leading politicians. And then when those assassination attempts fail, we then have the horribly macabre situation of them negotiating over forming governmental coalitions 3 days later, when everybody knows that an assassination was attempted. So one particular example that comes to mind is that Sadr tried to kill Ayad al-Lawi, who was the first American-appointed prime minister of Iraq, and was from the Islamic Dawah Party, a secular Shiite. And when the Iraqiyya Party, which is Sadr's political party in the Iraqi parliament, got a significant number of seats, he and Ayad al-Lawi were actually discussing the possibility of forming a coalition. They didn't end up forming a coalition, but the possibility was there. And so it's this very sort of weird game of trying to play a market strategy in the elections and also a non-market strategy in the elections, which is something that in Western democracies, of course, we don't do. And we addressed last time how the Iraqi constitution was built. And there's sort of two takeaways to really hammer down today about the Iraqi constitution and how it follows through. The first one is that the Kurdish Republic, Kurdistan effectively became somewhat independent as a result of this. And the Kurdish veto is not something unique to Kurdistan, actually, but within Iraq, if any two provinces refuse to implement a national policy, that national policy can become nullified. The reason for this is that Kurdistan is made up of 3 provinces. That way, the Kurds could veto anything that they didn't like coming from the central government and would preserve their autonomy and quasi-independence. The problem, of course, is that if there's any measure that's brought to the vote, which could limit corruption, grift, or other major statewide issues, the likelihood that you wouldn't have at least 2 states trying to overturn that law is very high. And so a lot of Iraqi politicians began to hide behind that possibility to increase what's called the Muhassa system. And we'll discuss that a little bit more in depth later. But in function, jobs are allocated to certain ethnic groups at a certain percentage corresponding with the population. And so a lot of this ends up resulting in nepotism. It ends up resulting in a certain degree of cronyism. And there's a question as to whether the nullification occurs strictly in the provinces nullifying, or if it occurs nationwide. It occurs nationwide. So this federal system that Iraq has constructed has a way that the individual provinces can nullify a law that is made at the federal level. The other major result that sort of follows from this Muhassa system, as well as from the nullification issue, is that Shiites become the dominant group in government. And of course, you're seeing Nouri al-Maliki in that picture that I have for Shiite sectarianism. And in the banner behind him, you can see Ali Sistani, the most powerful Grand Ayatollah in Iraq. Now, Sistani has no official political title. He is I said it last week, the Jerry Falwell of Iraq, in that he has incredible public appeal and people really take what he says seriously in a political way, but he has no office and no political party that is directly his. But the fact that Nouri al-Maliki, the prime minister of a diverse country, is standing with a picture of Ayad al-Lawi behind him, where it says Tariqna Nahwa Iraq, or our path forward in Iraq, really gives you an idea of how he was trying to mold the country and the sort of idealism that he had. Perhaps we could say he's a Shiite Arab national, in that he's pursuing a primus inter pares situation for Shiite Arabs of Iraq. And if we go back to the Sons of Iraq, right, that Sunni militant group that rose up in opposition to al-Qaeda and was supported by the Americans, it shouldn't surprise us that Nouri al-Maliki slashed their budgets once he had control of that, because of the sectarian difference between him as a Shiite Arab and them as Sunni Arabs. And this creates, especially as we get to the end of the aughts and beginning of the teens, much antipathy between the Sunnis and the Shiites, and the Shiites being, of course, the ones with political power, just as the Americans were leaving. The Americans left on the 16th of December, 2011. One of the funny things, actually, about the Americans departing is that the US President Obama gets most of the credit for the departure. And of course, he is responsible for it. It occurred during his tenure, but it was based on an agreement made between Nouri al-Maliki and George Bush in 2008, in 2007, before Obama in 2008, before Obama took power in early 2009. And so the American troops were actually in Iraq when Arab Spring happened. Now, remember, Arab Spring starts in January and February of 2011. So the Americans still wouldn't withdraw from Iraq for over a year. So the uprising and the Asqat al-Nizam, down with the system, that prevailed in Egypt did not prevail in Iran. There was no desire to bring down the system. But there were questions about the accountability of the individuals who were leading the country. And so you have, for example, the Day of Rage protest, which was 25th of February 2011, where Iraqis gathered, especially in Baghdad, but also in Basra and other large cities, to protest against the high degree of corruption and grift. One of the particular issues, for example, is that areas where the oil is produced, like the Shiite majority areas around al-Basra, are areas that, while producing a significant amount of Iraq's wealth, were not receiving it, which begs the question of where that money was going and who was taking it. Certainly, it wasn't the Basrawis, the people of Basra. They were not receiving these funds, and that became a consistent issue, and issues like that. There's a question, was the Sunni Shiite antipathy somewhat more pronounced in Iraq than in other MENA countries? I would say that the antipathy between Sunnis and Shiites in Iraq is something that waxes and wanes with the politics of it. When you have a situation like the Ottomans, where power is concentrated in a clan that has its loyalty to the Ottoman state, like the Georgian Mamluks, for example, in the 18th and early 19th centuries. And when I say Georgian Mamluks, I mean they literally came from the country today known as Georgia. They were made into slaves. They revolted. When they revolted, they conquered Iraq. And they played loyalty to the Ottoman sultans. But their loyalty, of course, was not to any population in Iraq. Their loyalty was to the sultan. And so they treated everybody deplorably. That, of course, there are moments when, for example, Suleiman Pasha did it better, but whatever. The difference, though, is that as we move after 1958, when we have a ruler who literally represents a certain part of the population, those groups become animated in defense or in offense to the way that the government is running. And I want to point out that the 2011 Day of Rage protests were often Shiites against Shiites. The Sunni Shiite divide is important to understand as a macro issue, but it's not the only issue that's going on in the country. In fact, another issue is one that I was just going to get to, which is that if we look at Kurdistan, Kurdistan has two different governments. And we're going to go in depth with this because it's actually quite important. There's the KDP, which rules over Erbil and Dohuk regions, and the PUK that rules over Suleimaniya region. And the KDP, or the Kurdistan Democratic Party, is particularly well known for being a all-in-the-family kind of government. Nearly everybody who runs the KDP is either a relative by blood or by marriage to the Barzanis. And so part of the Arab Spring in Iraq was the rise of the Goran movement, or the Kurdish movement for change. And there were protests throughout Erbil demanding that the KDP open up the possibility of governance to more different kinds of people, and the KDP actually shot the protesters. So again, that's Kurds on Kurds, purely for these political reasons. You also have a certain aspect of the Arab Spring protests that are in Shiite solidarity. A lot of the Shiites were protesting in March of 2011 because they were feeling a connection to the Shiites of Bahrain. The Shiites in Bahrain are a majority, ruled by a Sunni king. And during Arab Spring, the primary issue that the Shiites of Bahrain brought up was that they wanted equality, which they had been denied under the Sunni-led government. And so that could even be said to be a more extreme case, where Sunnis are more allied against Shiites. Because the moment that the Shiites were asking for equality in a relatively peaceful way, Saudi Arabia answered the call of the King of Bahrain and sent Saudi troops to invade the country and put down quite violently the Bahraini Arab Spring protests. Because the ask was much smaller in Iraq than in a lot of other Arab countries, the response could be smaller and still satisfactory. Nouri al-Maliki primarily argued that he wasn't going to seek another term as prime minister, and that he would provide subsidies on electricity, which would allow a lot more people to have power, electrical power, than otherwise. So that was a way of sort of giving back to the people. We should also understand that there were protests of other types, and we're going to see this as a recurrent theme. In 2011, in Kurdistan, there were protests against the Assyrian and Yazidi people Assyrian and Yarsani people who both drink wine. And a number of liquor stores in Dohuk, which has a significant Assyrian minority population, were trashed. And it took the Kurdish Peshmerga to bring order to the situation. Now, as we remember, Syria is probably the most devastated place in terms of Arab Spring. And there's no way that we could do justice to Syria's Arab Spring, even if we spent 5 hours just on that. So I want to highlight the one point that's really relevant for us, which is that when Syria collapsed as a unified, organized state in 2011, what ended up happening is that Al-Qaeda Iraq, which had been hiding out on the border, saw an opportunity to conquer land and actually establish itself. Now, it's important to understand just how unique that thought process is. And so we're going to talk a little bit about Islamic State and how that works. So the traditional view of the jihadist organizations like Al-Qaeda is that you have an internationalist agenda, right? Your agenda is for all countries, all regions. But what you would do is that you would use terrorism, you would use attacks on political figures, you would use other sorts of extra governmental means in order to compel the populations to move towards the direction of Islamism, of making Islamic theocracies. But you wouldn't actually build the theocracy yourself. There were, of course, groups that had a nationalist theocratic outlook, like the Taliban, who were Islamist as well, jihadist as well, but their view was nationalist in the sense that they wanted to conquer a certain piece of territory and govern it, but that was their aim. And so the Taliban, for example, never tried to invade Turkmenistan or Uzbekistan or Pakistan, because their goal, sorry, Pakistan, there's border cross through, but Tajikistan, all these areas that have large Muslim populations, because their goal is not to create an international entity. Their goal is to create an Afghanistan that is modeled in their image. And what Islamic State did is that it fused these two ideas. It took the internationalist piece from Al-Qaeda, and it took the territorial administrative piece from the Taliban. And this actually caused a massive break within the Al-Qaeda organization, because Al-Qaeda Iraq, led by al-Baghdadi, started to call itself Dawla Islamiyya, or Islamic State. In the early days, it was called Dawla Islamiyya Iraq wa Sham, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant region, or ISIL. But the goal was an international enterprise. Now, the reason Al-Qaeda rejected this is that Al-Qaeda, in many respects, saw its goal as this fomentation of a revolution through external means, not the creation of a theocratic state. And so Al-Qaeda Syria was actually one of the most vehement opponents of Islamic State while the two were existing. You may be familiar with Al-Qaeda Syria's alternate name, Jabhat al-Nusra, and it was part of the anti-Assad coalition. They were also anti-Islamic State, despite having nearly the same religious philosophy. It's simply a governmental disagreement and a political disagreement that they had. But what makes Islamic State special is not just this unique perspective. The next part that makes it unique, not relative to Al-Qaeda, but relative to a lot of other Islamic militant organizations, is the idea of franchising. So and this happens actually very similar to the idea of a franchise in a restaurant situation. So for example, let's take McDonald's. Not every location of McDonald's that you go to is actually owned by McDonald's. It's usually owned by a single proprietor who pays a certain amount of money and gets to use the McDonald's logo, serve the McDonald's food, they get deliveries and so on. But they've paid for the right to advertise as McDonald's, and therefore McDonald's has this extended reach without having to actually manually invest in every location. In fact, because they're being paid by the actual owners of the shop for the right to license, they only have upside, right? They only either get money or they get nothing when the person goes out of business. Islamic State did the same thing, in that if a jihadist organization wanted the renown, wanted the connectivity, wanted the ability to recruit, and all those other aspects that Islamic State had developed, and we'll talk about that development in a second, they could take the Islamic State name as a franchise. So if you look on the map in the upper right-hand side, you can see Islamic State franchises existed in about a dozen countries. And these were all different jihadist organizations. Like, for example, in Nigeria, it was originally Boko Haram. In Yemen, it was Al-Qaeda Yemen. In southern Russia, in the region of Dagestan, it was originally the Caucasian Imamate. So all these different groups began to call themselves Islamic State as franchises of this Islamic State. And that was part of its globalist outreach. The next thing that makes it unique, and is sort of the piece of why all these countries, all these different organizations would want to copy Islamic State, is that Islamic State pioneered within the jihadist world the process called self-radicalization. I think it's poorly named because it doesn't happen to the self. It happens because the person is targeted intentionally by material that will slowly change their perspective. And so they go through the radicalization process themselves. Now, of course, when this was going on, this was less familiar to people, but this actually could be equated very similarly to the YouTube algorithm or other types of social media algorithms that slowly begin to feed a person content that they'll agree with, but that becomes increasingly more removed from the central perspective. And you go into this sort of echo chamber. And by the end result of the echo chamber is that you agree with ideas that at the onset, you never would have agreed with. And that's why Islamic State was able to recruit from numerous different parts of the world very effectively, because they developed this self-radicalization system where a person on the Islamic State side would work with a person externally in order to give them the idea of going through with this. And of course, Islamic State used the technological prowess that it had to promote itself on all kinds of social media platforms. You can see this is a tweet that that Islamic State made. Many of their accounts exist on Twitter, exist in the dark web, exist all over in these different places. And in a lot of ways, this became their calling card. There's a question as to, in the self-radicalization, how was initial contact usually made? There are a lot of different ways it can happen. Probably the most common way is if somebody was interested in the possibility of knowing more about Islamic State, or just religious theocracy in general. There were certain imams that people knew by word of mouth who would be able to facilitate that kind of connection. So that's one possibility. Other possibilities include things like chat rooms. Islamic State would pose as friendly people in chat rooms, and just start up conversations and it was it's a long process, right? We have the actual stories of people who were radicalized by Islamic State, and it takes months. It's an intentional process to get these converts. But once you have them, once somebody has bought into the idea, it's very difficult to have them let go. Yeah. And Islamic State, because of its proximity to Kurdistan, naturally came into direct confrontation with Kurdish religious diversity. Now, we've talked about, for example, Yarsani. You can see the Yarsani in the upper left-hand corner sitting in a gem, which is their sort of prayer service, I guess you could say. They play musical instruments and meditate for a significant period of time, as opposed to having rote prayers. But that is their method of connecting with God. You have the Shabaki, who ascribe a certain degree of divinity to Shah Ismail, a Persian leader who lived about 500 years ago. You have the Alevis, who are an offshoot of Twelver Shiism. But probably most importantly of all, when it comes to the interaction with Islamic State, are the Yazidi. Now, Yazidi is a religion that developed from Zoroastrianism and some other admixtures. And the actual nature of the religion is very difficult to explain. There are concepts like reincarnation. There are concepts like Batiniya, right? The idea that what you see and can sense with your senses is not necessarily accurate. You have to know the secret, deeper meanings of all things. But probably the most important element to discuss, especially when it comes to the political dimension of Yazidism, is that the Yazidi, in addition to worshiping God, have a strong veneration for an angel demon, depending on your perspective, it could be one or the other, called Tavus Melek. Now, Tavus Melek arrived in the shape of a peacock. That is his symbol and his essence, but he sat among the other angels in heaven with God, and he rejected the idea of man being the central creation, and so was cast down into earth and had to live a life and understand what it meant to be human, and through that process began to feel a sense of redemption, began to feel a sense of connection to the humans and to God. And through the process of that return to God, of that self-clemency, he was ascended. And that idea of that return, that idea of that repentance, is the reason why the Yazidi venerate Tabu Melek. It also happens that the first part of that story of an angel in heaven that sees men, rejects them, and is cast down, is the story of Iblis in the Quran. And Iblis, of course, is the devil. So from the perspective of Islamic State, and also a number of devout Muslim worshippers who are not Islamic State aligned, the Yazidi are devil worshippers. As you can see, this is probably not going to bode well for them. So if we're talking about what Islamic State did on the territory of Iraq, once they had solidified their hold in Syria, in 2014, they launched a cross-border invasion into Iraq and hit the city of Mosul rather quickly. Now, Mosul was is the largest northern city in Iraq, right? The three major cities of Iraq are Baghdad in the center, Mosul in the north, Basra in the south. They hit the city of Mosul, and Mosul had been a city where Americans had put significant amounts of cash and military equipment that could, the cash, of course, to be used to pay the various different militias, like the Sons of Iraq, that the Iraqi government needed to pay, and the military equipment for the Iraqi army, which didn't even defend the town despite having significant numerical superiority over Islamic State. The reason for their retreat, different people have described it differently. Some say it was a lack of patriotism. It's the idea of a unified Iraq. Some say it was an unwillingness to die for people of other groups. Some people say that they were thinking about themselves as individuals, not about Iraq as a country, so on and so forth. But Islamic State took the city, and with it, they took some of the most advanced military equipment that any non-state actor has ever gotten a hold of. We're talking about a certain number of surface-to-air missiles, large numbers of tanks. If we remember from the previous page, all these Toyota trucks, most of the equipment that Islamic State used, most of the equipment that Islamic State used was acquired in this indirect way from the Americans. And this gave Islamic State a tactical edge. When they had control over the northern part of Iraq, they engaged in the systemic destruction, as well as in Syria. They engaged in the systemic destruction of historic sites, many of them from over 2,000 years ago, including, for example, you can see the city of Nimrud, which was an Assyrian city from about 2,700, 2,800 years ago. And there they are destroying the antiquities from the museum. The larger ones they destroyed, and they filmed themselves destroying it, arguing that they were removing the idolatrous pre-Islamic civilizations. And the smaller bits they actually sold on the black market as part of the way of funding their economy through illicit art sales. Islamic State was also able to fund itself through the exportation of oil. And when they captured Mosul, they captured a number of the oil wells that were near to that city, and they began to export it. It's believed that their primary exportation route is through Turkey, and there have been convoys of Islamic State oil tankers moving through the Kurdish highlands to Turkey in order to do that. And Americans and Russians have bombed those convoys at different points. The biggest moment of Islamic State's advance, or perhaps we can say the push back against Islamic State, was when Islamic State attacked Sinjar Mountain. Now, Sinjar Mountain is the location of a significant Yazidi population, and so the Peshmerga felt obligated to defend it. And it's worth taking a second to talk a little bit about the Peshmerga's situation. So the Peshmerga are the Kurdish militia forces from both the KDP and the PUK. And with respect to Islamic State, the two of them fought side by side. The bigger issue, however, was that the KDP and the PUK were extremely worried that other militia groups might crop up and then play into the larger sectarian wars between them, between the two of them, and between them and larger Iraq. And so they forcibly disarmed most minority groups within their territory. That included the Yazidi and that included the Assyrians. And so what you end up having are areas where Islamic State will literally walk into these townships and just take them over. You have people who flee and people who are taken as sexual slaves if they're women, or physical slaves if they're men. And this kind of attack was what Islamic State was planning for Sinjar. With American aerial assistance, the Peshmerga launched a campaign to try and fight Islamic State on the mountain and was eventually able to push them back. Most of the American air support was conducted from Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, because the United States troops hadn't been brought back to Iraq at this point. Nouri al-Maliki would convince the Americans to come back in a small percentage, maybe a few thousand specialists, but nothing terribly large. And eventually the Peshmerga and the newly reconstituted Iraqi army were able to push together and force Islamic State out. Now, the Peshmerga actually stopped themselves when they got as far south as they had in this green and lighter green picture, because they didn't want to take territories that were majority Arab in order to avoid the political ramifications of that. So once we have Islamic State removed, we then have the Kurdish on Kurdish issues. And so we should talk a little bit about those. The first one is that if we remember, in 1994 to 1998, there was a Kurdish civil war, and the primary fighters in that war, of course, were the KDP and the PUK. But there were other Kurdish affiliate groups that supported either one or the other. For example, the KDP was supported by the PDKI, which is the People's Democratic Kurdistan of Iran. They had fled Iran, come into Iraq, and they were hosted by the KDP, and of course, because they were hosted by the KDP, they fought on their side. The PUK aligned. The PUK is slightly more socialist in their outlook. The KDP is a little bit more market economics in their outlook. And so because the PUK was a little bit more socialist in their outlook, their allies were naturally more left-wing, like the PKK, the Kurdish militant group that operates in Turkey. Some of them fled to the PUK territories and fought alongside them. Also the KCP, which is the Kurdish Conservative Party, which is an Islamist group that felt that they were more tolerated in PUK territory. But because the PKK was aligned with the PUK, Turkey naturally began to form an alliance with the KDP. Because the enemy of my enemy is my friend, sort of. And so you have this relationship that begins to develop, especially as we get into the later teens, between the KDP and the Turkish government. You can see, for example, Nechirvan Barzani, the current leader of the KDP region of Kurdistan, with Erdogan. They discussed numerous different treaties. And in fact, most trade out of Kurdistan goes through Turkey. It doesn't go through the rest of Iraq, including most oil shipments that will then get routed to an oil pipeline that goes to Tbilisi, that goes to Ceyhan on the Mediterranean Sea. So you have this weird situation where the KDP and the Turks are bedfellows, despite the fact that the Turks, as we talked about in Syria, attacked the YPG, which is a Kurdish group in Syria, and the Turks have their war against the PKK within Turkey proper. And by contrast, Turkey uses the fact that it has an alliance with the KDP as a way of demonstrating that they're not anti-Kurdish, they're just anti-these Kurdish. So it's this weird sort of situation. And then the flip side also happens, where Iran has good relations with the PUK because the PUK is the enemy of the KDP, whose ally is the PDKI. So Iran, in order to target the PDKI, aligns itself with the PUK. So, for example, you can see that house in Erbil that Iran hit with a missile on the 13th of March, 2022. Iran has done this several times, launching missiles at different locations in Erbil where they believe PDKI Kurds are living. This this creates this sort of intensification of the historic Kurdish on Kurdish conflict, because now they have external belligerents that are willing to weigh in on their conflict with each other. Now, thankfully, they haven't gone to war again because both of them are willing to respect the no man's land and the separation between them. But the possibility of fratricide grows under this situation. The next thing that's worth discussing is that when the Kurds fought against Islamic State, they expanded their holdings, and you can see the furthest extent that they had on October 19th, 2017 in the light green. And you can compare that to the actual borders of Dohuk region, Erbil region, and Suleymaniye region. And the 2003 line, which represents what they were allocated as Kurdish territory. Because of this expansion of territory, the Kurdistan government began to incorporate territories that had significant non-Kurdish populations in them. Now, the Kurds argue that these were historically Kurdish regions. They were repopulated in 1970 due to actions of the Baathists, but these are historically Kurdish regions, and therefore they should belong to Kurdistan. This created a situation where the local inhabitants of the various regions didn't want to be under Kurdish control, but Kurdistan wanted to assert their power anyway. And one particular example I wanted to bring up is the story of Lara Yusuf. I don't know if she's still the mayor of Al-Qosh, which is a town in northern Iraq of about 14,000 people. But she was as of 2021, and the Kurds basically appointed her without respecting what the people in that town would have chosen. Now, Lara herself is Chaldean Catholic. She's not a Kurd. She is a Christian, and the majority of the city of Al-Qosh is Christians, but they're Christians of a different sect than she is. And they continually refuse to recognize her as the mayor of the city, despite the fact that she is the mayor of the city, and she was made that way by the Kurds. In fact, when the Kurdish referendum occurred, she celebrated the Kurdish referendum for independence, which was certainly not the perspective of the majority of the Christian inhabitants of that city, which see themselves as part of the fabric of Iraq, not part of the fabric of Kurdistan. Speaking about the independence referendum, this was led primarily by the KDP, but the PUK participated as well in supporting the idea of a non-binding referendum, because they couldn't pass anything without constitutional approval, that Iraqi constitutional approval that would have binding effect, but they wanted to have a referendum on the possibility of Kurdish independence. And of course, that referendum came up overwhelmingly in support of independence, but because of that, the Iraqis retaliated. So starting in mid-October, the Iraqi military directly engaged the Kurds at Kirkuk and numerous other locations to push back on Kurdish-controlled territory where those territories were contested, let's say, between Kurds and non-Kurds. So those maximalist claims that the Kurds previously had basically went away because of the independence referendum. And those October 29th, 2017 borders between Kurdistan and the rest of Iraq remain the borders between Kurdistan and the rest of Iraq. Incidentally, Al-Qosh is on the Iraqi side of the border, if memory serves. And as I mentioned during the Iraqi civil war period, Iran also had a large part to play in the overthrow of Islamic State, and the way that they did this was through the improvement and expansion of the militias that they already had in the region, like Asa'ab al-Haq and Jaysh al-Mahdi. Both of them were reformulated and renamed, but basically it's those same entities. But they added another one to the mix, which was the Popular Mobilization Forces. And the Popular Mobilization Forces, despite being a majority Shiite group, recruited from Iraq's diverse population. They had Christians, they had Sunni Muslims, they had Kurds, in order to give the semblance that this was a collection of the various stripes of Iraqi diversity. The population mobilization forces in Iraq effectively took the place that Hezbollah takes in Syria and Lebanon, being or primarily more in Lebanon, where they act as both a political appendage because they have connections to a number of politicians, and they have power on the street in order to convince and compel people. And since this is a tried and true formula in Syria, in Lebanon, it became a tried and true formula in Iraq as well. As we move into the more recent years, we see an intensification of Iraqi politics. And so starting in 2016 starting in 2015, but intensifying especially in 2018 after the Islamic State threat had receded, you had large-scale riots throughout the country. Some have called the anti-Muhassa riots because the majority of the riots were in opposition to this Muhassa system, this forced quota system, because they believe that it's open to grift and other types of calculations. And some of that was withdrawn, but most of it was not. Another important thing to point out is the United States Embassy was attacked in the latter days of 2019. And so the United States retaliated with an assassination of both Qasem Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis. Both of these are members of the IRGC, the Iranian Pasdaran, that were increasingly moving troops and soldiers through Iraq to Syria. And this extrajudicial killing soured Iraqi-American relations, especially from those who have a more pro-Iranian perspective, but also served to weaken the power of Iran in the country. And that weakened power was felt in 2021, where parties connected with pro-Iranian perspectives didn't do as well as one may have hoped. Following that debacle, a drone was sent at the house of Mustafa al-Kadhimi, and Mustafa al-Kadhimi, who was the prime minister of Iraq at the time, was not generally favorable to Iran, but he survived the attack, and accordingly, Iran had much more difficulty pushing their policy in Iraq. But really, the nail in that coffin was the recent issue in 2022 between Sadr on one side and the pro-Iranian forces on the other, where the Sadrist militia actually, well, first, Sadr got the votes to be in parliament, but the other side refused to form a coalition with him. So he resigned his commission and, quote, walked out of politics, which, of course, anybody who knows Sadr knows he's not walking out of politics for long. And Sadr then came back with his militia and walked into the green zone. And they fought through the PMF, right, that Popular Mobilization Force, that Iranian proxy group, in order to get to the parliament. And so now in 2023, we're in a weird situation where the secular Shiites and the Sadrists are considering an alliance against pro-Iranian forces. And Americans from the outside are kind of curious if Sadr's anti-Americanism will manifest, or whether he's so anti-Iran at this point that it'll be a functional ally, if not an actual one. All right. Any questions, comments, or concerns on the Iraq half of this evening? There's a question about, do you have any theories about where Iraq is headed now? I honestly don't have a lot of hope for where Iraq is headed. I think that the level of grift and corruption that currently exists in the country is too high for anything really positive to happen. And the shift away from a presidential system to a parliamentary system, while good from the perspective that it requires consultation, and so Iraqis will have to learn to live with each other, it also means that no decisive action can be taken by any one person unless everybody supports decisive action. And that's very unlikely to happen. So I worry very much about the longevity of Iraq. I think Iraq is going to slowly become very similar to Lebanon, where there's one party that's effectively the Iranian puppet and controls about 40% of the parliament. And the opposition to that is really 20% of the parliament, and the other 40% of seats are up for grabs for whoever can make that coalition work. And it's usually going to be a pro-Iranian party. So I'm not really optimistic about Iraq. I hope that sort of addresses that. What do I suspect is the role of the US war and how things are working out? I think what the US war did is that it allowed the possibility of a non-Saddam government to occur. Because in my view, I don't see a way how without external action, Saddam Hussein ever loses power. He just had too large of a military for any insurgency to take him out. He had numerous body doubles. There had been numerous attempted assassinations on him throughout history. He wasn't going anywhere. So I think that, like Hafiz al-Assad, basically he would have been in power until he died, and then his son would have taken up after him. Maybe it would have been, it probably would have been Qusay, because Qusay is probably more intelligent than Uday was. But it would have, yeah, the situation would have been repressive. So I guess sort of the question is, what do you do when the genie's out of the bottle? That's sort of the issue. But I think that at this point, the actions of the US are relatively attenuated from where Iraq is. And at this point, it's really Iraqis' choice whether to stand or fall. But the thing is, in order to stand, they all have to stand together. So usually what happens in a society is that you have one person who leads and everybody follows. That can't happen in Iraq. And so you have to figure out a new way to make that democratic transition happen. So there's a question. So we opened up the possibilities, but had no idea how to encourage them in positive. No, I think that the United States made two key errors in the invasion of Iraq. The first key error was that we didn't go with what General Aaron Shinseki said when he said that we would need hundreds of thousands of soldiers, not just 120,000, to pacify the country, and de-Baathification as opposed to de-Saddamification, which was suggested by the CIA, which would have removed those who were at the highest echelons of government, but left most Ba'ath Party individuals still. I think that situation would have been a lot better than doing what the United States did, which completely destabilized the society from both a functional perspective, because there were thugs on the street everywhere that couldn't be controlled, and from a organizational perspective, because all the people who were educated couldn't be part of government. The question of what to do when you have the ability to actually choose your politicians, I mean, that really comes down to what the people are willing to put forward, what the people are willing to stand up for. And if you talk to Iraqis who fought on the American side or who served alongside Americans, they believed in the possibility of democracy. They believe in the process of liberal governance. They believe in these kinds of aspects, even if they were Sunni, even if they had people who they knew who were Ba'ath Party members. If they like, it's the functional problem is that the Americans created a federalized system for a country where common cohesion is not at its best, but I can't imagine creating a non-federalized system and not expecting it to be even worse. So I don't know. This is History Mostly Ancient Discussions. You have listened to Middle Eastern Islamic History. I am Richard, and we meet Wednesdays at 7. Next week, we will pick up from here with Adnan Menderes's electoral victory in 1950, and the twists and turns that are going to happen between the Democrats losing power, the CHP coming back in power, the development of the Turkish diaspora in Europe, and the rise of Islamism within the Turkish electorate, all kinds of interesting things as we move our way through the Cold War and its effect on Turkey. Of course, we also have Asian philosophy, which is every Saturday. We discuss European Union security periodically. That's me and Aaron. We've got Jane taking a break this month from her Powerful Women. And of course, we just did our Russo-Ukrainian War series about earlier this month. And so maybe next month or maybe in September, we'll do another Russo-Ukrainian War series. And so questions, comments, concerns. And of course, thank you everybody for the kind words. Mark?
Yeah, Richard, thanks very much. My question is better posed just orally. When you were talking about the de-Baathification in Iraq by Bremer, if I remember correctly, the guy's name. At the time, I wasn't sure quite which was the best idea, because people would raise the analogy that denazification worked in Germany. What were why is that necessarily a bad analogy? I mean, Greg, before things went
No. That's a fair point, because it was before 2006. There were outbursts and problems, but there wasn't anything like what would happen as a result of de-Baathification. One of the things I forgot to mention with regards to Islamic State is that many of the key generals of Islamic State had been part of that melange of Baathists who had joined Al-Qaeda Iraq, and therefore had actual military expertise, which is why Islamic State won so many of those early victories. But I guess we can say the denazification is a good parallel to de-Baathification, and the Italians in 1943 of decapitating the leaders and leaving the infrastructure intact would be closer to de-Saddamification. And the thing is that when we decapitated the Italian leadership in 1943, the new government was able to act immediately, right? The Italian government in 1943 declared war on the Axis, began to field soldiers into the Allied camps for marching north up the peninsula, because the Nazis had taken control of northern Italy from Italian soldiers when Rome fell. And that government more or less worked. There was a referendum in 1946 as to whether it would be a democracy or a kingdom, and the kingdom barely lost. But that was effective with minimal military occupation, minimal turnaround time. There are more long-term issues. I would say Germany's a better built state than Italy, but I don't know if that has more to do with German cultural tendencies, let's say, than Italian cultural tendencies. So, but Germany is a state under military occupation, and we militarily occupied Germany for 80 years. We're still in Germany. We have not brought our troops home. So if we were willing to make that kind of commitment in Iraq, where we were going to put enough troops to stabilize the situation, and we were going to stay there for decades, then I think that, toppling the government and a complete de-Baathification would be great. I don't think that was in the cards. Not if you'd asked anybody in 2005, should we be in Iraq for 2 decades minimum, I don't think anybody would have been on board with that. So that's part of it. the other part of it is that the reason why denazification was so important is because the Nazi ideology was such a fundamental aspect of how most German high-ranking officers were perceiving their role. There were very few cases of a person who was a Nazi and like just did not care about the ideology. Just if tomorrow the Nazi ideology was, you know, we love Jews, they would have been, you know, over the moon about that. They're like they just had no truck with the ideology, they just needed the job. And certainly that happened, but that didn't happen at the higher levels of command. Across the Wehrmacht, across the Schutzstaffel, across all of the different German organs, you had strong Nazi sympathies. So there was no way to reintegrate these people into a governing apparatus without that possibly resurging. And that's not the case with Baathism. Most Baathists in Iraq had no articulated sense of what Baathism was. When I articulated it in Saddam's vision of a holier than thou Arab society as benighted by Islam, and a hybridization of historic Iraqi nationalism and pan-Arab nationalism, I don't think most Iraqis would describe it like that at all in that sort of clinical way. They would just say it's whatever Saddam says. And so that doesn't inspire a lot of loyalty to the idea after the person is gone. So I don't think it was necessary in the way that it was, that denazification was necessary in Germany, and I don't think the follow-through was there. That would make sense.
Okay, thank you.
So that's why I don't think that everybody made the example of Germany, and I don't think it's appropriate.
Yeah, it has more superficial than I was thinking at the time.
Yeah. All right. Any further questions before we close this out?
No, thank you very much.
All right. I'll see everybody next week then.
See you next
All right.
week.
Bye.